On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced the United States' abandonment of the gold standard on national television, causing global recession and instability that lasted into the 1980s. The wisdom of Nixon's bold and unilateral action has been debated by pundits and scholars ever since. Like so many presidents before and after, Nixon was left holding the bag for the actions of a widely known but poorly understood cabal of elite bankers who elevate and destroy nations and peasantry with the stroke of a pen. Was Nixon a pawn in a global power struggle over the hegemony of the U.S. dollar and American exceptionalism, or was he the sole voice of opposition who said, "This far and not further"? I am Mark Jacobin, along with my brother James, and this is Truth and Other Lies. Nixon Saves the World. James, what's the first thing people think of when they hear the name Richard Nixon?
That the Milhouse character on the Simpsons cartoon was named after Nixon?
All right. What's the second thing they think of?
That he resigned the presidency in 1974 after it was discovered that he was part of a criminal conspiracy.
Also known as the Watergate scandal.
Also known as the Watergate scandal.
I'm sure the good folks at home have heard enough about Watergate. Let's focus on something more interesting.
What's more interesting than the president paying hush money to petty criminals who were caught tapping the phones of the political opposition?
How about a president who destroyed the world's economy with a single televised speech?
Donald Trump has a lot to live up to.
He does indeed.
If Nixon destroyed the global economy with a single speech, why is the title of the episode Nixon Saves the World?
That's how he saved the world, by destroying the economy.
Oh, I get it. No, I don't. What do you mean?
In the history of picking the lesser of two evils, Nixon faced a choice like none other. In fact, it was the second greatest challenge faced by modern presidents.
What was the greatest challenge?
Whether to use a sand wedge or a pitching wedge on the single-hole golf course at Camp David.
Oh, so how did the world arrive at a state of affairs where Nixon was forced to chip into a water hazard?
I blame George Washington. He accepted Alexander Hamilton's argument of the implied powers of government inherent in the Constitution by signing the bill that created the first Bank of the United States on February 25, 1791, starting a chain of events that would oppress the American worker for more than a century and put the United States in hock to the tune of $35 trillion.
Is that all?
No. The first stock bubble and government bailout occurred that same year, as speculators drove up the price of rights to buy the stock in the first Bank of the United States, prompting Alexander Hamilton to stabilize prices using public funds.
Like a bailout.
Just like a bailout. That was followed very quickly by the Panic of 1792, requiring the government to once again bail out a private bank, and not for the last time.
So, the government's been bailing out banks since literally the beginning of time.
Quite.
The first United States bank was chartered from 1791 to 1811. It was succeeded by the Second Bank of the United States from 1816 to 1836. President Andrew Jackson vetoed the bank's renewal in 1832. In 1833, he used the power of his office to remove all U.S. funds from the bank and prevent future deposits.
While it can be argued that the first United States bank successfully reined in risky and exploitive practices of local banks, primarily by regularly exchanging local banknotes for hard currency,
in those days, hard currency was gold and silver.
the same cannot be said for the Second United States Bank, which expanded the role of the bank from a regulatory function to a vehicle of profiteering and control by restricting the local banks and expanding its own powers. This is why the charter of the Second Bank of the United States expired in 1836 and was not renewed. That led to Abraham Lincoln launching the only successful foray of government-issued United States currency, the so-called greenback, which competed with banknotes issued from New York State banks that were backed by British investors. Greenbacks, formerly United States notes, were redeemable for gold and then silver until they were discontinued in 1971, but constituted a minuscule fraction of currency in circulation. Greenbacks were unique in that issuing them did not incur debt. In fact, among the dozens of ill-founded notions about Lincoln's assassination, one of them is that he was killed by international bankers for letting the United States print its own money.
Did anyone tell John Wilkes Booth about that?
I don't think so. This takes us to the Third United States Bank.
I don't remember reading about a third United States bank.
That's because of clever marketing by the big bankers. After banks had once again overextended their positions and caused the panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan and his fat cat cronies got together to convince the U.S. government, that would be Teddy Roosevelt, that they could manage the economy better if they had complete control over it, including the power to command the Treasury Department to mint coins and print money.
And at that time, the term Second United States Bank left the same bad taste in people's mouth as Watergate does today. So they avoided using the term Third United States Bank.
Precisely. Enter the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 that created the Federal Reserve System, a central bank that fooled people into believing it was not a central bank. But before we embark on the fascinating and eye-gouging journey of exploring the Federal Reserve, let's provide some context. For more than 100 years, the global financial system has been defined by two factions. The economists who devise formulae and mechanisms by which to govern global finance, and the banks, big and small, who distort, pervert, leverage, and finally break those mechanisms, resulting in crashes, bank runs, recessions, depressions, and mountain ranges of debt that will not be reconciled before the next great social collapse. There are 4 datum points that illustrate the global financial situation Nixon inherited when he became president in 1969. The first datum point is the gold standard, a topic we covered at length in Truth and Other Lies, episode Argumentum Aureus Fallacius, available at jacobinbrothers.com under featured episodes, but we'll give the Cliffs Notes version in this episode. The second datum point is Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, issued in 1933.
Is that the one where he made possessing gold by people or businesses illegal?
Yes. And the third datum point is the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Or as we like to call it, the Bretton Woods extortion racket of 1944.
Yes, we'll get to that. The fourth datum point is a cursory understanding of America's central bank, known as the Federal Reserve. Did you catch all of that?
Number 1, the gold standard. Number 2, FDR outlawing possession of gold. Number 3, the Bretton Woods Agreement. Number 4, the Federal Reserve.
Starting at the top, tell us about the gold standard.
Well, that would be anytime Tom Cruise makes a movie, he rants to his production crews about his production company being the gold standard, which people think might be an influence from Scientology.
And what about the gold standard as it relates to the financial system?
In the simplest terms, the gold standard means one can exchange paper money for gold. In 1971, that was $35 an ounce, as set by the Bretton Woods Agreement.
So I could walk into any bank and exchange my paper money for gold?
Of course not. Only nations who were a party to the Bretton Woods Agreement could exchange paper dollars for gold.
Well, that's a bummer.
Remember, it was illegal for people or businesses to possess gold.
And that brings us to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, issued in April 1933. James, why was my boy Frankie D acting like a fascist asshat and taking away people's gold?
Well, once again, you can blame the banks and the speculators. There was a number of active and imminent financial crises in play, and FDR felt that converting gold from a currency to a commodity was necessary to stabilize the American dollar, both domestically and abroad. all of the gold in the country was turned into the Federal Reserve, where it was surrendered to the U.S. Treasury, melted down, cast into gold bars, and sequestered in Fort Knox, Kentucky.
James, you've heard of Robin Hood?
Sure, rob from the rich, give to the poor.
FDR's nickname was Robbin' Everybody. At that time, gold was both a currency and a commodity, and people saw their only real wealth confiscated by the government and replaced with worthless slips of paper featuring the pictures of dead politicians. In addition to commandeering gold from people and businesses, he also required the Federal Reserve banks to surrender their gold.
I imagine that ticked off the Federal Reserve.
And I'm certain of it. Remember that little nugget because it will become important later in the episode. Let's move on to the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944.
The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 set the price of gold at $35 an ounce, and 44 countries assembled at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, agreed to fix their currency to a proportion of the American dollar, thereby creating an international gold standard.
Of course, it was much more complicated, mostly because politicians and bureaucrats were involved. In addition to agreeing to what was really an American dollar standard rather than a gold standard, the conference also created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, two important U.S.-controlled institutions created ostensibly to help nations recover from the devastation of World War II, but primarily used to the advantage of the American economy and industry. We will discuss those wonderfully philanthropic constructions in a future episode.
Signatories to the Bretton Woods Agreement included the UK, Russia, China, Mexico, most of Europe, and other countries affected by World War II.
James, let's check our progress.
Number 1, the gold standard. Nations can redeem dollars for gold.
Number 2, the consolidation of all American gold in Fort Knox under the control of the U.S. Treasury Department.
Number 3, the Bretton Woods Agreement, where 44 countries agreed to fix their currency to the U.S. dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce.
When we return, we will introduce the Federal Reserve System. Hello, this is Mark Jacobin. If you are enjoying this Jacobin Brothers production, and even if you are not, you can support this and other extraordinary programming by donating at jacobinbrothers.com. Navigate to jacobinbrothers.com, click the Donate button, and follow the instructions. We accept PayPal, Venmo, GPay, Apple Pay, and all major credit and debit cards. If you keep your currency in large burlap sacks with dollar signs on them, we will be happy to meet by the railroad tracks after midnight for the exchange. Donate at jacobinbrothers.com. Your support is appreciated greatly. And now on to everybody's favorite talking point, the Federal Reserve.
I know it's mine.
The Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913. It created a privately controlled central bank, unconstitutionally forfeited the United States power to control its money supply, and created a debt-based economy from which the country will never be free. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, another major piece of legislation that will forever oppress the American people was passed that same year. James, what might that be?
The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without any regard to any census or enumeration.
Also known as the 16th Amendment, it created what we now refer to as the personal income tax, something that had been declared unconstitutional until that point.
But what does the 16th Amendment have to do with the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve Act and the 16th Amendment are two sides of the same coin. Although out of scope for this discussion, I encourage people to ponder the timing of creating a debt-based economy that enriches the 1% and the means by which to service that debt by taxing people for simply existing.
The global financial system is a massive, complex Ponzi scheme. Some might even consider it to be a legal criminal enterprise of within the Federal Reserve System is a co-conspirator.
We will skip over the fascinating details of the Fed's structure, responsibilities, and the wonders of a debt-based Keynesian-esque economy, and focus on the attributes of the Fed that pertain to this discussion. James, what is the most common perception that people have about the Federal Reserve?
Nearly everyone I've talked to thinks it's an agency of the federal government.
And is it?
No. It is a government-empowered private entity that answers to neither the president nor Congress. The president appoints the chairman and can remove a member of the board of governors for cause, but that's never happened.
And you'll find plenty of people who will defend the structure, powers, and independence of the Fed. But those are people who benefit from the status quo, or who are educated or employed by institutions who benefit from the status quo. The popular reference is quasi-governmental, but the Fed's monetary policy is exempt from congressional oversight by statute. The Fed follows only one rule, the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules.
But I thought the Treasury had all the gold.
It certainly makes one think, doesn't it?
You've mentioned more than once that the Federal Reserve is a private institution. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is outside the scope of this episode. What is important for people to know is that the federal government has no control over monetary policy or interest rates. The $6 trillion that have flooded the market since 2019 and created record inflation was the sole decision of private bankers.
So people who like to blame President Biden for the economy are barking up the wrong tree?
For all of the things that one might blame lame duck Joe, the economy is not one of them. One of the Fed's responsibilities is to control the amount of money in circulation. While this is easy to visualize in terms of printing currency, the actual mechanism is through the use of interest rates. The lower the rates, the more money member banks will buy from the Federal Reserve, and in turn lend or invest that money in productive industries. This increases the amount of money in circulation. High interest rates discourage member banks from borrowing money, thus limiting the expansion of the money supply.
So low interest rates increase the money supply and high interest rates limit the growth of the money supply?
Correct.
So what about actually reducing the amount of money in circulation?
Well, James, because all of the money in the current system is imaginary, if people are not busy imagining the money, then it simply doesn't exist, except perhaps as an entry in some bank's accounts receivable ledger.
But what about the paper money in circulation?
There is no correlation between paper money in circulation and the amount of imaginary dollars that have been created by the Federal Reserve. Right now, there are about $2.2 trillion of paper currency in circulation. Compare that to the $35 trillion national debt, and you can see that the great majority of currency is imaginary.
And how did we get to the financial crisis of 1971?
Because the left hand has no control over what the right hand is doing. The left hand being the U.S. Treasury, and the right hand being the Federal Reserve. But first, we must understand the effect of the Bretton Woods Agreement. It made American dollars as good as gold, literally. Thus, countries began to buy and hoard American dollars the way they had hoarded gold in decades past, knowing that they could change those dollars for gold. Secondly, the Federal Reserve was printing dollars as if they were going out of style. But in fact, the opposite was true. The whole world wanted American dollars, and the Federal Reserve was happy to oblige. And by 1960, the number of dollars in circulation exceeded the gold in Fort Knox by several multiples.
But if the Fed was printing so much money, Why wasn't inflation a problem?
Because everybody wanted dollars. The world's economy was expanding faster than anticipated, and the Fed could barely keep up with demand. And because countries were hoarding dollars, there was not enough excess currency in circulation to spur inflation. So inflation wasn't a problem yet. The problem was redeemability. Countries such as France, who was the last to leave the gold standard and still valued gold reserves above all else, became nervous that the dollars in circulation exceeded the gold in the U.S. Treasury.
And they weren't wrong. By 1965, President of France, Charles de Gaulle, was cashing in $150 million a month at a time when the Treasury only held $15 billion in gold.
And as early as 1962, President Kennedy was being urged to devalue the dollar to $70 per ounce of gold to compensate for the excess dollars in circulation. Remember when FDR stole everyone's gold?
Yep, he even took the gold from the Federal Reserve banks.
Now it was time for revenge of the Fed. After 1944, the U.S. Treasury had to redeem dollars for gold. But what did they not have control over?
How many American dollars were printed?
Exact. The U.S. Treasury has no control over monetary policy. That authority resides with the Fed and the Fed alone. The Fed was running the printing presses night and day, irrespective of the implication to the global or domestic economy.
And why would they do that?
Because the banks, who are stakeholders of the Federal Reserve System, receive a 6% dividend annually from the Federal Reserve. The more money the Fed makes, the more money the member bank makes. The member banks make. This is where the advertised independence of the Fed breaks down. The Fed is wholly owned by its member banks, and its member banks benefit from profitable decisions, whether those decisions are good or bad for everyone else.
So, in effect, the Federal Reserve, which is really a cabal of 2,900 American banks, was writing checks that were drawn on someone else's account, namely the U.S. Treasury.
Exactamundo. The Fed could print as much money as it wanted because the U.S. Treasury was the one holding the bag, literally. In 1971, when Nixon announced that American dollars would no longer be redeemable for gold, there were at least 70 billion paper dollars in circulation, but only $10 billion of gold in Fort Knox.
When Nixon took America off the gold standard, he wasn't making a decision as much as he was simply acknowledging the reality that we had not been on the gold standard since the 1950s.
We have set the stage, we have identified the villain. When we come back, let's learn about our hero. 830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it is a great idea. Call or text 830 Jacobin anytime. If we like what you have to say, we'll discuss your comments on the air. If we don't like what you have to say, you'll hear about that too. 830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it should be.
Richard Milhouse Nixon, the man known to many Americans as simply, "I am not a crook," the only president to resign office and be effectively exiled. He wasn't banished to Elba or St. Helena, as Napoleon was, but to his home in San Clemente, California, where America could safely ignore him and pretend to move on from the Watergate scandal. He spent the 20 years of his post-presidency writing books on foreign policy and political affairs, and giving interviews to anyone who would listen about his views on pre-Nixon and post-Nixon presidencies, advising every president from Gerald Ford to Bill Clinton. Behind the scenes, of course, no president would admit Nixon's involvement at the time because his name was so toxic. From the scandal of the break-in and cover-up at the Watergate Hotel to the economic turmoil of the 1970s. Politicians distanced themselves from the name of Richard Nixon in public, even if they sought his advice in private. Nixon's unfortunate and regrettable legacy is that his misdeeds were amplified to the point that his accomplishments in American politics and foreign policy have been forgotten. And yet, the world would look very different today if Richard Nixon had not been president. Why did Dwight Eisenhower make Nixon the youngest vice president in history? Why was Nixon merely the 35th president of the United States, losing to John Kennedy in a very close and in some minds very suspicious election? Why is Nixon admired in China, France, and Russia, not just by their leaders, but by their citizens? President Nixon possessed a knowledge and a skill of foreign affairs that is not found in high school textbooks and retrospective works. Richard Nixon was the most intellectual president since Franklin Roosevelt. He could see the world the way it was, not the way he wished it to be. His accomplishments in foreign policy eclipsed both Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, and the foreign policy of the Trump-Biden era may as well be a PBS after-school special. Nixon's foreign policy continues to shape the world to this day, from opening China to establishing détente with the Soviet Union. He understood that China cared only about its own security, which was threatened when the Soviet Union cozied up to China's rival, India. He perceived the ideological rift between China's General Secretary Mao and Soviet Premier Brezhnev over the interpretation and application of Marxist philosophies, and leveraged this rift to an American advantage. Indeed, to the advantage of the entire world. Nixon opened a dialogue with the People's Republic of China, who'd been isolated from the Western world since the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949, and was the first American president to visit the newfound republic in February of 1972. 3 months after Nixon's historic visit to China, he held the first of 3 meetings with Soviet Premier Brezhnev, reducing the strain on American-Soviet relations that had remained high since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 and exasperated by the Vietnam War. Nixon and Brezhnev established a period of reduced tensions known as détente that would last until the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. During this period, the Nixon administration negotiated the first treaty with the Soviet Union to limit the number of nuclear weapons by each country, later known as the SALT I Treaty. The Middle East was just as volatile then as it is today, and through the deft use of force, the threat of force, and timely diplomacy, Nixon orchestrated a ceasefire in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The world seemed to be full of hostile actors, all of which were neutralized by Richard Nixon, including the end of the Vietnam War in 1973. Among America's modern chief diplomats, Richard Nixon is the only one who could have negotiated a watchful peace with the Soviet Union and set the stage for diplomatic relations with China. If Nixon had remained in office until his term expired in 1977, the circumstances that created the rise of Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton would not have existed, and the presidential landscape would be unrecognizable from what transpired. Unfortunately, the arrogance that comes with success and the paranoia that comes from a pathological need to maintain power were the two foes Nixon could not subdue. They conspired to remove him from the presidency on August 9, 1974, and Nixon's public image never recovered. The world would never see the final achievements of America's last true statesman and the best foreign policy architect since Ben Franklin.
Nixon is making peace with Russia. He is preventing Israel from being wiped off the map. He is exploiting the rift between Russia and China to bring China to the negotiating table. He is ending the war in Vietnam, along the 1954 truce line of the 17th parallel. He is reducing nuclear arms in America and Russia, And doing all of this while the global financial system is crumbling around him.
And if he doesn't fix it, none of the rest matters.
Wow. Compared to Nixon, Trump and Biden are schoolyard chumps.
You said it, not me.
On August 15th, 1971, Nixon goes on television and declares that dollars can no longer be exchanged for gold. James, what was the terrible aftermath of that announcement?
The stock market went up.
That certainly seems counterintuitive.
The anxiety about the overvaluation of the dollar and the shrinking gold reserves had been growing for several years. The announcement may have been a surprise to Jane and John Q. Public, but for the financial sector, this was a long-awaited decision. However, the longer-term effects were more detrimental. The devaluation of the dollar brought home the effects of inflation by a global economy saturated with dollars. The dollar began to float against other currencies, and this created uncertainty in the markets, as well as the increasing the cost of imports.
And what would have happened if Nixon had not acknowledged reality?
What had already been happening on a small scale? A run on Fort Knox. Countries would continue to demand gold in exchange for dollars. Fort Knox would run out of gold in very short order. History suggests this would crash the dollar and create another global depression like the 1930s.
But we don't know for sure.
Well, nobody has a crystal ball, but ignoring a problem this large couldn't have ended well.
And not ignoring it didn't end well either. But by drawing a line in the sand, Nixon may well have headed off a run on American gold reserves.
That's one thing we can say for certain. We didn't give up our gold.
By December of 1971, the Bretton Woods system is abandoned globally, and the dollar is worthless, although it is still holding value against foreign currencies, mostly because they are worthless as well, and everybody is agreeing to pretend in the value of their currencies.
Gotta love global finance, huh?
Yeah. But Tricky Dick has a card up his sleeve that will prop up the dollar for the foreseeable future, although at a cost of not fewer than 3 wars, as time would tell. James, what is a petrodollar?
Petrodollar is the name given to dollars that are supported by crude oil, specifically Saudi Arabia. The same way the American government convinced China to buy $1 trillion in T-bills after the crash of 2008, Nixon convinced King Faisal to buy U.S. Treasury bonds to finance the American government and to sell oil in dollars. Eventually, OPEC started trading oil in dollars so that any country who wanted to buy petroleum from OPEC had to first buy dollars.
Thus, Nixon prevented a run on Fort Knox, found a new foundation for the dollar, and saved the world, at least from the American perspective.
Is there any other perspective that matters?
Not according to the school books.
What did you mean when you said petrodollars would cost 3 wars?
Part of our arrangement with Saudi Arabia was security. This is why we funded the Iraqis in the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. War number 1. Then Oliver North came along and started selling arms and munitions to Iran during that same war. So we'll skip over the appearances of treason that come along with that. That's war number 2 that we're funding. And finally, the Gulf War of 1991. America and its allies didn't commit almost 1 million people and hundreds of millions of dollars to just save a country no one had ever heard of. War number 3.
Yeah, I think historians might challenge you on a couple of those points.
I'll gladly debate any historian for the same fee Hillary Clinton receives for giving a speech. Actually, I'll do it for half.
I have to say, this money stuff is pretty confusing.
It's a complex topic, and simplifying it runs the risk of obfuscating how it actually works. It doesn't help that every establishment economist obfuscates it anyway. For example, when you read about Nixon's departure from the gold standard, the cause is never investigated. It's always, the amount of money in circulation was greater than the value of gold in Fort Knox. Nobody ever asks why or who was responsible. It's not as if the Fed accidentally left the printing press running overnight and then accidentally shipped a few dozen pallets of $100 bills to Europe. The Fed knew exactly what it was doing. It just didn't care, at least about the potential detriment to the average American. James, any final thoughts?
I think Nixon should have a monument. Unlike Kennedy, whom everyone adored because he gave good speeches, Nixon actually did things that Kennedy only talked about. He opened China. He entered détente with the Soviet Union, ended Vietnam, reduced nuclear arms, and headed off a global financial disaster. What did Kennedy do? He got shot in the head.
You've been listening to Truth and Other Lies.